The ghost of who Thomas Hayes used to be haunted the stale air of his small third-floor apartment. 52 years old, but the lines etched around his eyes and bracketing his mouth were carved by more than time. They were maps of sleepless nights and desert suns, of memories that clung to him like sand in his clothes. Thomas was a man built on a sturdy frame, tall and once broad-shouldered, but now a subtle stoop suggested a weight far heavier than flesh and bone. His brown hair, cut short in the unshakable habit of a military man, was surrendering to a distinguished silver at the temples. It was a face that could have been handsome, rugged even, but was now mostly just tired. He had once been Lieutenant Commander Hayes of the Navy SEALs, a man his wife adored and his two children looked up to with admiring eyes. He had been the pride of his family. Now he was just Thomas, a name that felt hollowed out and foreign on his own tongue. The uniform was packed away in a footlocker he never opened. The wife and children were ghosts too, living in cheerful, sunlit photographs on a dusty mantelpiece he tried not to look at. They had left not out of malice, but out of weary self-preservation. The man who came back from the war was not the husband and father who had left. The battlefield had followed him home, setting up a permanent outpost in his mind, and his chosen weapon was the amber liquid in the bottle that was never far from his hand. A low whine broke the oppressive silence. Thomas looked down from the grimy window overlooking a rain-slicked Portland street. A large, wet nose nudged his idle hand. Scout, his only constant, his shadow, his anchor, a 5-year-old German shepherd of striking appearance. His thick coat was a handsome mix of silver gray and white, more wolf than dog. His ears were perpetually alert, his dark, intelligent eyes missing nothing. Scout possessed the quiet dignity and unwavering loyalty of his breed, a calm, steady presence in the storm of Thomas's life. He moved with a silent grace, his temperament a perfect counterbalance to Thomas's own jagged edges. Right now, those eyes held a look of gentle concern. "I'm all right, boy," Thomas rasped, his voice rough from disuse. He scratched behind Scout's ears, the simple, repetitive motion a small comfort. Scout leaned into the touch, a silent reassurance that he was not going anywhere. The truth was, Thomas was not all right. The day had started badly and was spiraling downward. A car backfiring on the street below had sent him diving for cover behind the sofa, his heart hammering against his ribs, the smell of cordite and dust filling his senses. The memory faded, but the tremor in his hands remained. His first instinct, the one he had trained himself to obey, was to reach for the whiskey bottle on the coffee table. That night, the ghosts were particularly loud. He drank to silence them, pouring glass after glass until the room blurred and the sharp edges of his pain grew dull. He didn't remember falling. He awoke to the rough, insistent lick of Scout's tongue on his cheek and a low, distressed whine. The sun was a cruel sliver of light cutting through the blinds. Thomas was on the floor, his head throbbing with a vicious rhythm. The empty whiskey bottle lay on its side a few feet away, a fallen soldier. He pushed himself up, his body aching in protest, and caught his reflection in the dark screen of the television. He saw a stranger, a gaunt, hollow-eyed man with a slack jaw and a pallor that spoke of deep soul sickness. Scout whined again, nudging his hand, his eyes filled with an unbearable, knowing sadness. In that moment, looking at the reflection of the man he had become and seeing the unconditional love and worry in his dog's eyes, something inside Thomas snapped. It was not a loud crack, but a quiet, profound shifting. He could continue this slow, pathetic descent and die alone on this floor with only his dog to mourn him, or he could change. The thought was terrifying. Change required an energy he wasn't sure he still possessed. But the alternative, the image of his own lonely death, was even more frightening. He stumbled to his feet and walked past the whiskey bottle, heading for the shower. For the first time in a long time, he was choosing something other than oblivion. The decision, once made, set off a cascade of others. This city was killing him. Every siren, every shout, every crowded street was a trigger. He needed silence. He needed space. He needed to get out. His savings were almost gone, bled dry by rent and alcohol. He owned his old pickup truck and the few pieces of furniture in the apartment. It wasn't much. He sold the truck first, the last tangible piece of his former life. The cash felt heavy and inadequate in his pocket. It wouldn't be enough for a new life, but maybe, just maybe, it was enough for a new start. That night, instead of opening a bottle, he opened his laptop. He scrolled past rental listings he couldn't afford. He wasn't looking for another apartment, another box to slowly die in. He was looking for a lifeline. On a whim, he typed Rural Property Auction Oregon into the search bar. He found a county website for tax-delinquent properties. Most were small parcels of land or homes that started far beyond his reach. But then he saw it, a listing with a single grainy photo. An old farmhouse, its paint peeling, surrounded by overgrown land. The description was brutally honest. Significant structural issues, no utilities connected, sold as is. But the starting bid was only a few $100s. It was located in a remote part of the state, miles from any real town. It was perfect. With a trembling hand, Thomas registered for the online auction. He sat there, Scout's heavy head resting on his knee, and watched the countdown timer. This was it, his final gamble. When the bidding started, he placed his bid, a number that represented nearly every dollar he had to his name. For a heart-stopping minute, another bidder competed with him, but they soon dropped out. A message flashed on the screen, sold. He had just bought a broken-down farmhouse he had never seen, in a place he had never been. A wave of nausea and fear washed over him. What had he done? He looked down at Scout, who looked back up at him, tail giving a slow, confident thump against the floor. For the first time in a decade, Thomas Hayes didn't know what tomorrow would bring. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt less like a threat and more like a possibility. The drive out of Portland was a slow exhale Thomas hadn't realized he'd been holding for years. With each passing mile, the dense cityscape of concrete and steel gave way to towering Douglas firs and a sky that seemed to open up, vast and gray. Scout sat in the passenger seat of the newly purchased, rust-pocked utility van, his nose pressed against the window, occasionally letting out a soft woof at a passing deer. The van was packed with the meager sum of Thomas's worldly possessions: a footlocker, a duffel bag of clothes, a few tools, and a large bag of dog food. Thomas followed the directions from a printed map, turning off the main highway onto smaller, winding roads. The air grew cooler, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. A fine mist, so common in this part of Oregon, began to fall, clinging to the windshield and blurring the edges of the world into a soft watercolor painting. As they drove, Thomas's mind drifted to a time before the military, before the wars. He had grown up in rural Pennsylvania, the son of a farmer who worked the same fields his grandfather had tilled. Thomas had once dreamed of a similar life, the rhythm of seasons, the satisfaction of working with his hands, the simple peace of a night sky unspoiled by city lights. But his father's farm had been lost to debt, and Thomas had enlisted, seeking structure and purpose. Now, decades later, he was returning to a version of that dream, though the circumstances were far from what he had imagined. The small township of Raven Valley appeared briefly, a cluster of buildings that included a general store, a diner, a post office, and a handful of houses gathered around a crossroads. Thomas slowed as he passed through, noting the curious glances from the few people on the street. In the window of the diner, an elderly man in overalls watched him pass, his gaze lingering with the frank appraisal of someone who rarely saw new faces. Thomas's stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since morning. He pulled over and parked in front of the diner, a weathered wooden building with a sign that read Maggie's Home Cooking in faded red letters. "Wait here, Scout," he said, giving the dog a reassuring pat. "I'll be quick." Inside, the diner was warm and smelled of coffee and fried potatoes. A few customers sat at the counter, and their conversation died as Thomas entered. He felt their eyes on him, not hostile, but wary, assessing. A middle-aged woman with copper-colored hair pulled back in a practical bun approached, wiping her hands on her apron. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice neither friendly nor unfriendly. "Coffee and whatever sandwich is fastest," Thomas replied. "To go, please." As she moved away to prepare his order, the hushed conversation resumed. Thomas caught fragments: Oakwood farm, and city folk, and waste of money. He kept his eyes down, but his ears, trained by years in hostile territory, missed nothing. When the woman returned with a paper bag and a foam cup, her expression had softened slightly. "You bought the old Oakwood place, didn't you?" she asked. Thomas nodded, surprised. Word travels fast. Small town, she said with a shrug. I'm Faye Morgan. My family's been in Raven Valley for 4 generations. Thomas Hayes, he replied, offering his hand. She shook it, her grip firm. That place has been empty for nearly 30 years. Got quite a history. Oh? Thomas found himself genuinely curious. Faye glanced at the other customers, then lowered her voice. Just a word of advice. Folks around here don't talk much about Oakwood Farm, especially not around the Prescott family. They own half the valley, including the lumber mill and most of the businesses in town. Why would they care about an old farm? That's a long story, Faye said, her eyes shifting to the door as the bell chimed, announcing a new customer. Her expression changed, closing off. That'll be $7.50 for the food. Thomas paid and took his food, sensing the sudden chill in the atmosphere. As he turned to leave, he nearly collided with a tall man in an expensive-looking hunting jacket. The man was perhaps 60, with salt and pepper hair and the weathered complexion of someone who spent time outdoors. His eyes, a pale, icy blue, assessed Thomas with immediate dislike. "Pardon me," Thomas said, stepping aside. The man didn't respond, just continued to stare at Thomas with undisguised suspicion. The tension in the diner was palpable, conversations completely silenced. Thomas left, feeling the man's gaze boring into his back. When he climbed back into the van, Scout greeted him with enthusiasm, oblivious to the strange encounter. "Something tells me we're walking into more than we bargained for, boy," Thomas murmured, offering half his sandwich to the eager dog. After another 20 minutes, he found the turnoff the map indicated. It was less a road and more a suggestion, a gap in the trees nearly swallowed by ferns and blackberry bushes. He eased the van through the opening, the branches scraping against the metal sides like skeletal fingers. The driveway was a long, rutted track of dirt and gravel. As he rounded a final bend, the house came into view. Thomas's heart sank. The photograph online had been charitable. In reality, the house was a wreck, a testament to decades of neglect. It was a 2-story farmhouse that had once been painted white, but now the paint was a leprous patchwork of peeling flakes, revealing the weathered, silver-gray wood beneath. The front porch sagged at a dangerous angle, its railing splintered and broken. Several windows were shattered, their empty frames like vacant eyes, while others were boarded up haphazardly. The yard was a wild, untamed jungle of knee-high grass, thorny bushes, and determined weeds that crept up the sides of the house as if trying to pull it back into the earth. "What have I done, Scout?" Thomas murmured, shutting off the engine. The sudden silence was absolute, broken only by the gentle patter of mist on the roof. Scout, however, did not share his dismay. The moment Thomas opened the door, the German shepherd leaped out, his tail held high. He began exploring immediately, his nose to the ground, taking in the symphony of new smells with undisguised delight. He bounded through the tall grass, a flash of gray and white against the wild green. Watching him, a small corner of Thomas's tension eased. He got out of the van, his worn work boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. He walked slowly toward the house, his gaze taking in the full scope of the decay. It was overwhelming. The task of making this place habitable seemed impossible. A fool's errand. And yet, as he stood there, a strange feeling began to settle over him. It was quiet, a deep, profound quiet he hadn't experienced in years. There were no sirens, no shouting from neighboring apartments, no rumble of traffic. There was only the sound of the wind whispering through the tall pines that ringed the property. For the first time, the noise inside his head seemed to recede, pushed back by the immense, peaceful silence of the place. Despite the ruin before him, he felt a flicker of something he had long thought dead: tranquility. He was so lost in the moment that he didn't hear the approaching vehicle until it was nearly upon them. An old, faded blue pickup truck, coughing and sputtering, rumbled up the driveway and parked next to his van. The driver's side door creaked open, and a small, wiry woman who looked to be in her late 70s emerged. She wore sturdy boots, denim jeans, and a thick flannel jacket. Her white hair was tied back in a practical bun, and her face was a roadmap of wrinkles that deepened when she smiled, which she did now. Her eyes were a bright, curious blue. Scout trotted over, not with aggression, but with polite curiosity. He sniffed her offered hand and, seemingly satisfied, allowed her to scratch his head. "Well now, he's a handsome one," the woman said, her voice clear and strong. I saw the van turn in. Haven't seen anyone come up this driveway in years. Figured I should say hello. I'm Eleanor Winters. I live just down the road a ways. Thomas Hayes, Thomas replied, extending a hand. Her grip was surprisingly firm. This is Scout. Eleanor's gaze shifted from Thomas to the dilapidated house, a knowing look in her eyes. She held up a basket she was carrying, a clean dish towel covering its contents. Brought you a little something, a welcome to the neighborhood. And I figured you wouldn't have a working kitchen in there for a while. That's very kind of you, Thomas said, genuinely surprised by the gesture. Thank you. No trouble, she said, waving a dismissive hand. So you're the one who bought the old Oakwood place. We all wondered who would be brave enough, or maybe foolish enough, to take it on. Oakwood, Thomas asked as he accepted the heavy, warm basket. The smell of baked bread and savory herbs wafted up. That's right, belonged to Dr. Julia Bennett, Eleanor explained, her tone shifting slightly, becoming more serious. Brilliant woman, a botanist, you know, knew more about the plants in this forest than anyone. She bought this place back in the 80s, fixed it up real nice, had the most amazing gardens. Eleanor gestured toward the overgrown wilderness of the yard. You wouldn't know it to look at it now. What happened to her? Thomas asked. His curiosity piqued. Eleanor's smile faded completely. She lowered her voice as if sharing a secret. She disappeared about 30 years ago now. Just vanished into thin air one day. Her car was still here. All her research, her clothes, everything. The police came, looked around for a bit, but never found a trace of her. It was the strangest thing. She leaned a little closer. Folks around here have their stories. Some say she just packed up and left, started a new life, but I never believed that. She loved this land too much. Others, she paused, her blue eyes locking with his. Others say her spirit never left. They say on quiet nights, you can still see a light moving in the upstairs windows. Thomas, a man who had faced horrors far more tangible than ghosts, simply nodded. He was too tired to entertain local legends, but the story of the brilliant doctor who vanished lingered in his mind. Well, Eleanor said, straightening up as if shaking off the somber memory, I'll let you get settled. If you need anything, a hand with something or just a cup of coffee, my place is the one with the red mailbox about a mile back. Don't be a stranger. With a final pat for Scout, she climbed back into her noisy truck and rumbled away, leaving Thomas and his dog alone once more. The mist had thickened into a steady drizzle. Thomas looked from the warm basket in his hands to the dark, silent windows of his new home. It wasn't just an abandoned house anymore. It was a house with echoes, a place holding a 30-year-old mystery. The first morning at the farm dawned cold and damp, a thick fog blanketing the valley, muffling the world in a shroud of gray and reducing the surrounding forest to a series of faint, ghostly silhouettes. For Thomas, it was the first morning in years that he had woken up without a pounding headache and the bitter taste of regret in his mouth. He had slept in the back of the van, wrapped in a thick sleeping bag, with Scout curled up at his feet, a warm, living weight that was both comforting and grounding. After a simple breakfast of coffee brewed on a camp stove and the delicious bread Eleanor had given him, he stood before the farmhouse, hands on his hips, surveying the challenge. It was a battleground, and his new enemy was decay. Drawing on a lifetime of naval discipline, he decided to tackle it with strategy. He would clear and secure one room at a time, creating a small island of order in the sea of chaos. He chose the room to the right of the main entryway, a space he assumed had been the study. Of all the rooms on the ground floor, this one felt the most personal, the most like the heart of the house. Sunlight, weak and filtered by the fog, struggled through the grimy window panes, illuminating swirling galaxies of dust motes. A massive oak desk stood against the far wall, its surface covered in a thick gray blanket of dust. Bookshelves lined another wall, many of their contents having tumbled to the floor, their pages swollen and warped by moisture. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, damp wood, and time itself. Armed with a heavy-duty trash bag, a broom, and a crowbar for stubborn debris, Thomas set to work. He started by clearing the fallen books, handling them with a strange reverence. They were mostly scientific texts, books on botany, chemistry, and local ecology. Scout explored the room with his nose, sniffing every corner with intense interest, before finally settling on an old rug near the desk, watching his master with patient eyes. For the first hour, the only sounds were the scrape of the broom on the wooden floor and the rustle of debris filling the bag. Thomas fell into a rhythm, the mindless physical labor a welcome distraction. Then Scout began to act strangely. It started with a low whine. Thomas glanced over. The dog had gotten up from the rug and was sniffing intently at a section of floorboard in the corner, just to the left of the heavy desk. His tail was low, giving a slow, uncertain wag. "What is it, boy? A mouse?" Thomas asked, going back to his sweeping. But Scout didn't stop. The sniffing became more frantic. He began to paw at the floorboard, his claws making a soft scratching sound on the old wood. The whine grew louder, more insistent. "Hey, leave it," Thomas commanded, his voice firm. "There's enough here to fix without you tearing up the floor." Scout paused, looked back at Thomas with an almost pleading expression, and then returned to his task with even more determination. The pawing turned into digging, and a sharp, demanding bark echoed through the silent house. Thomas stopped working, leaning on his broom. This was not normal behavior. Scout was a disciplined mouse, not prone to random mischief. This was focus. This was purpose. He had seen that same look in Scout's eyes on training fields, a single-minded intensity that did not waver. Sighing, Thomas walked over. All right, I'm coming. Show me what's so important." Scout backed away slightly as Thomas knelt, running his hand over the floorboards. They seemed solid, no different from the rest, but as he pressed down on the spot Scout had indicated, he felt a faint give, a slight springiness that wasn't there in the adjacent planks. His curiosity finally overriding his skepticism, he went to retrieve the crowbar. He wedged the flat end of the tool into the thin gap between the boards and pushed. The old wood groaned in protest. With a final sharp crack, the board splintered and lifted. Scout barked once more, a sound of triumph this time. Thomas peered into the opening. Beneath the floor was not dirt and foundation, but a small, dark, man-made cavity. And nestled inside it, protected from the damp and the dust, was a plain rectangular tin box. His heart began to beat a little faster. He reached in and lifted it out. It was heavier than he expected, its surface cool to the touch. There was no lock, just a simple latch on the front. He sat back on his heels, the box resting on his knees, with Scout nosing at it excitedly. For a moment, he hesitated, feeling like an intruder prying into secrets that weren't his. But this was his house now. Its history, its echoes, its secrets. They were all his. He unfastened the latch and lifted the lid. Inside, protected by a layer of oilcloth, was a single object, a thick, leather-bound journal. He carefully lifted it out. The leather was soft and worn with use, and the pages were yellowed at the edges. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat, elegant, and precise. "Property of Dr. Julia Bennett," it read. He carried the journal over to the front steps of the house, where the light was better, and began to read. Scout lay at his feet, resting his head on his paws as if his job was done. The early entries were filled with scientific passion and a deep love for the Oregon wilderness. Dr. Bennett wrote about her work, her dream of isolating a specific compound from a rare local species of fern she called the ghost fern. Her notes were detailed, filled with complex formulas and diagrams Thomas couldn't fully comprehend, but he understood the goal. She believed this compound could halt and perhaps even reverse the devastating effects of Alzheimer's disease. Her writing was full of hope, the words of a brilliant mind on the verge of a breakthrough that could save thousands of lives. As Thomas turned the pages, however, the tone began to shift. The hopeful scientific entries became interspersed with notes of caution and worry. About a year before her disappearance, the entries grew more infrequent, the handwriting slightly less steady. Then he reached the final few pages. The scientific notes were gone, replaced by short, fearful sentences. "He knows about my progress. His offer is an insult to the work, an insult to nature itself. He sees only profit, not people." Thomas's blood ran cold. He read the next entry. "He visited again today unannounced. He is a man who is not used to being told no. He said I was being naive, that my discovery would mean nothing without his company's resources. It felt less like a statement and more like a threat. Then the very last entry, dated just 2 days before the date Eleanor had said she disappeared. I have to hide this. I have to hide everything. I fear what EP will do when he learns I will never sell. He is a man without a conscience. Thomas stared at the two letters, EP. The quiet house suddenly felt different, the silence no longer peaceful but menacing. Scout had not just found a dusty old journal. He had uncovered a secret that 30 years ago might have been worth killing for. Thomas spent the rest of the day in a state of restless contemplation. The journal, now hidden in his footlocker, had transformed his simple renovation project into something far more complex. He found himself staring at shadows, listening to the old house creak and settle, wondering what other secrets it might hold. That evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of lavender and deep blue, Thomas sat on the porch, nursing a cup of instant coffee. Scout lay beside him, alert but relaxed, occasionally raising his head at the rustle of a small animal in the underbrush. The sound of tires on gravel announced another visitor. A well-maintained pickup truck, newer than Eleanor's, pulled up. A man in his early 60s climbed out. He was about Thomas's height, with a solid, sturdy build that spoke of a life of physical work. He had a thick head of gray hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and calm, observant hazel eyes. He wore a clean work shirt, durable canvas pants, and steel-toed boots. He moved with a quiet confidence, his hands resting easily at his sides. Scout, who had been watching Thomas struggle from a safe distance, let out a single low bark. The man stopped, holding up a hand in a gesture of peace. "Easy there, big fella," he said, his voice a low, pleasant baritone. "I'm not here to cause trouble." He looked at Thomas. "Saw you from the road. Name's Robert Dalton. I live a couple miles west of here. Retired carpenter." Thomas stood, offering his hand. "Thomas Hayes." Robert's handshake was firm, the handshake of a man who had spent his life gripping tools. "Eleanor mentioned you'd bought the old Bennett place. Thought I'd stop by, see if you need a hand. That porch is about to give way completely." Thomas followed Robert's gaze to the sagging porch. "I'll get to it eventually." Robert shook his head. "That beam's about to go. You keep walking on it like that, and you're going to bring the whole roof down on your head." Thomas bristled, his ingrained self-reliance and distrust of strangers immediately kicking in. "I've got it handled." Robert didn't seem offended. He simply walked a little closer, his expert eyes scanning the structure. "That's black rot. It's eaten clear through the post, and it's probably in the joist too. You can't just prop it up. You need to brace the roof properly first, then cut out and replace the whole corner section." Robert's assessment was calm, professional, and undeniably correct. It only made Thomas more defensive. He felt exposed, his incompetence laid bare. "Thanks for the advice," he said, turning away, "but I don't need any help." Robert was quiet for a long moment. Thomas could feel the man's steady gaze on his back. "Listen," Robert said finally, his voice losing none of its calm. "I'm not looking for work. I've got more than enough projects of my own. But I also don't want to see my new neighbor get himself killed on his first week here. I've got the tools and the lumber in my truck. Let me help you brace it. It's the neighborly thing to do." Thomas stopped, his hand hovering over his coffee cup. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to send this stranger on his way. Accepting help felt like admitting defeat. It was a weakness he had never allowed himself. He looked at the rotting beam, at the precarious angle of the porch roof, and then at his own two hands, which were not enough for this fight. He thought of Scout, who depended on him entirely. Getting crushed under his own porch wouldn't do either of them any good. Swallowing his pride was a bitter pill, but it was necessary. He let out a slow breath and turned to face Robert, giving a short, grudging nod. "All right, what do you need me to do?" A faint, understanding smile touched Robert's lips. "Good, let's get to work." The next few hours were a blur of focused activity. Robert was a master of his craft, directing Thomas with clear, concise instructions. They built temporary supports, carefully transferring the weight of the roof off the compromised corner. There was little talk, just the companionable sounds of saws, drills, and hammers. Thomas, used to the clear chain of command and shared purpose of the military, found himself falling into an easy rhythm with the other man. Robert didn't pry or ask personal questions. He simply worked, his competence a quiet, reassuring presence. As they were measuring a replacement beam, Robert paused and looked at the intricate woodwork along the edge of the roof. She always did have an eye for detail, he murmured, almost to himself. She? Thomas asked. Dr. Bennett, Robert clarified. I did some work for her when she first moved in, built her bookshelves, repaired some of these windows. She was a good woman to work for. Paid fairly and always had a cold glass of lemonade waiting. Very smart, very dedicated to her work. He shook his head slightly. It was a real shame what happened. Robert's words added another dimension to the woman in the journal. She wasn't just a victim or a ghost story anymore. She was a person who had hired a local carpenter, who had an eye for detail, who served lemonade on a hot day. The mystery deepened, and for the first time, Thomas felt a connection to her, a sense of shared tenancy across time. By late afternoon, the porch was stabilized, the rotten wood cut away, and a new, solid corner post securely in place. It wasn't finished, but it was safe. The two men stood back, covered in sawdust and sweat, looking at their handiwork. It's a start, Robert said with satisfaction. I couldn't have done it without you, Thomas admitted, the words feeling strange but right. Thank you, Robert. Like I said, just being neighborly, Robert replied, already packing his tools. You've got a long road ahead of you with this place. Don't be too proud to ask for help. As Robert's truck disappeared down the driveway, Thomas remained on the porch, running his hand over the new sturdy beam. Scout came and sat beside him, leaning his weight against Thomas's leg. The air was growing cool as the evening approached. He looked at the solid porch, at his loyal dog, and thought of the quiet, capable man who had asked for nothing in return. For the first time in a very, very long time, Thomas Hayes didn't feel completely alone. But as the shadows lengthened across the yard, his thoughts returned to the journal hidden in his footlocker. The initials EP nagged at him. There was a story here, a dark one, and somehow he had stumbled right into the middle of it. The initials EP were a splinter in Thomas's mind. For 2 days, he tried to ignore them, focusing on the practical, back-breaking work of clearing the yard and patching a leak in the roof. But the name haunted the quiet moments, a ghost more real than any local legend. He was a man trained to assess threats and to gather intelligence before acting. He couldn't move forward without knowing who he was up against. The isolation of the farm, once a comfort, now felt like a liability. He needed information. He left Scout on the newly secured porch with a fresh bowl of water and a command to stay. A command the dog obeyed with a soft whine of reluctance. Thomas drove the van into Raven Valley, parking in front of the small public library, a modest brick building sandwiched between the post office and a hardware store. Inside, the library was cool and quiet, smelling of old books and floor polish. A few elderly patrons browsed the shelves, and a middle-aged librarian with cat eyeglasses looked up from her desk as Thomas entered. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I need to use a computer," Thomas replied. She pointed to a small alcove where 2 outdated desktop computers sat. 30 minutes per person. Password is on the monitor. Thomas nodded his thanks and made his way to the alcove. Sitting in the uncomfortable plastic chair, he felt conspicuous in his worn flannel shirt and jeans, a rough-hewn figure in a world of digital information. He started his search broadly, typing in Alzheimer's disease research, 1985-1990, and pharmaceutical companies Oregon. The search yielded a torrent of scientific papers and articles. He patiently sifted through them, his eyes scanning for anything connected to the Pacific Northwest. After an hour, the librarian had either forgotten or ignored the 30-minute rule. He found a series of financial news articles about a promising, aggressive company called Prescott Biotech. In the late 80s, they had poured millions into developing a revolutionary treatment for Alzheimer's disease. His pulse quickened. He clicked on an article profiling the company's CEO. A picture loaded onto the screen showing a man in an expensive suit, younger than, with dark, slick-back hair and a smile that was all confidence and sharp edges. His name was Ethan Prescott, EP. Thomas felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He kept digging. He found article after article detailing Prescott Biotech's spectacular public failure. After bold predictions and a soaring stock price, their clinical trials had collapsed. The drug was ineffective and had dangerous side effects. The news had sent their stock plummeting, wiping out fortunes and deeply humiliating its proud CEO. The timeline was a perfect match. Prescott's public failure occurred just months before the threats began appearing in Dr. Bennett's journal. It was all there. The motive was as clear as day. Ethan Prescott was a man who had failed, and it appeared he had found someone to blame, or rather someone from whom he could steal a success. Thomas printed a few of the key articles, his hands shaking slightly as he pulled the warm pages from the printer. This wasn't a ghost story. This was a story about greed, power, and a rich man who did not like to lose. As he was leaving, he paused at the librarian's desk. "Excuse me, I'm new in town. What can you tell me about the Prescott family?" The woman's expression shifted, becoming guarded. The Prescotts own Prescott Biotech. They're the largest employer in the county. Mr. Prescott's father started the company in the 50s, but it was Ethan who really built it into what it is today. And they still live around here? The main estate is about 20 miles north, but they own property all over the valley, including the lumber mill. She leaned forward slightly. "You're the one who bought the old Bennett place, aren't you?" Thomas nodded. The librarian glanced around, then lowered her voice. "Word of advice, don't ask too many questions about Dr. Bennett, especially not around the Prescotts or Sheriff Bailey. Some stories are better left buried." Thomas thanked her and left, the warning settling like a cold weight in his gut. He drove back to the farm with the name Ethan Prescott echoing in his head. The weight of the discovery was immense. He was no longer just a man fixing a house. He was the custodian of a secret that had gotten a brilliant woman killed, a secret involving a man who was now one of the most powerful figures in the county. Back at the farm, the afternoon sun was warm, filtering through the tall pines. He let Scout out for a run, needing a moment to clear his head. He watched the dog bound through the meadow behind the house, a picture of pure, uncomplicated joy. But then Scout's demeanor changed abruptly. He stopped mid-stride, his head raised, his nose twitching as he tested the air. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Before Thomas could call him back, Scout took off. He didn't run playfully, but with the focused, driving speed of a predator on a scent. He veered away from the meadow and plunged deep into the dense, old-growth forest that bordered the property. "Scout! Heel!" Thomas shouted, his voice sharp with command. The dog ignored him, disappearing into the shadows of the ancient trees. Cursing under his breath, Thomas took off after him. He ran through the thick undergrowth, branches whipping at his face, his heart pounding with a mix of annoyance and fear. He could hear Scout's frantic barking up ahead, a beacon guiding him deeper into the woods. He finally burst into a small, secluded clearing, dominated by a thick, gnarled thicket of wild ivy and blackberry bushes that had grown into an impenetrable wall of green. Scout was at the base of it, digging furiously, sending dirt and leaves flying. He was barking without pause, his entire body trembling with intensity. "What in the world have you found now?" Thomas panted, trying to catch his breath. He grabbed Scout's collar, but the dog was single-minded, straining against his grip to get back to his digging. Thomas looked closer at the spot. It was just a mound of earth and vines, no different from the rest of the forest floor. But Scout's certainty was infectious. Trusting the dog's instincts, which had already proven sharper than his own, Thomas began to tear at the thick vines, his hands quickly becoming scratched and raw. He pulled away layers of tangled green, clearing away decades of overgrowth. After several minutes of hard work, his fingers brushed against something cold, hard, and unnatural. Metal. He worked faster, his adrenaline surging. He tore away the last of the covering and stared in disbelief. Hidden beneath the mound, flush with the earth, and almost perfectly camouflaged, was a heavy rectangular steel door with a rusted iron handle. A cellar door, in the middle of the woods, far from the house. It took all of Thomas's strength to pull it open. The hinges screamed in protest, and the door lifted with a groan, revealing a set of steep concrete steps leading down into darkness. A cool, musty, but clean smell, like a wine cellar, wafted up. He took a flashlight from his pocket and aimed its beam into the depths. The light revealed a small, windowless room, but it was no cellar. It was a laboratory. Unlike the house, this place was pristine. a time capsule sealed away from the elements. Stainless steel counters lined one wall, holding beakers, microscopes, and complex scientific equipment that gleamed in the flashlight's beam. Shelves on the other wall were filled with neatly labeled jars of dried plants and glass vials of liquid. Charts and molecular diagrams were pinned to a large corkboard, and on a central workbench sat a stack of thick, meticulously organized binders. Thomas descended the steps, Scout close at his heels. He walked over to the workbench and opened the top binder. The pages were filled with the same neat, precise handwriting from the journal. But this wasn't a journal. This was the work itself, the complete, unadulterated research with detailed experimental data, documented results, and the final perfected formula for the compound derived from the ghost fern. He stood there in the silent subterranean lab, the beam of his flashlight illuminating the life's work of Dr. Julia Bennett. This was it. This was the treasure Ethan Prescott had been after. This was the secret she had died to protect. And now he was the one standing guard. A chill ran down Thomas's spine that had nothing to do with the cool air of the underground chamber. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a historical curiosity. This was a scientific breakthrough worth billions of dollars, hidden away for 3 decades. He carefully began to examine the binders, trying to make sense of the complex formulas and chemical diagrams. Though much of it was beyond his understanding, he could grasp the basics. Dr. Bennett had isolated a compound from the ghost fern that showed remarkable ability to repair damaged neural pathways, the very pathways that Alzheimer's disease destroyed. Her notes detailed successful trials with lab mice, showing not just prevention, but actual reversal of symptoms. On a small shelf near the workbench, Thomas found a series of carefully preserved specimen jars, each containing pressed samples of a delicate, almost translucent fern. It had an otherworldly quality, its fronds so pale they seemed to glow in the beam of his flashlight. "The ghost fern," he murmured to Scout, who was sniffing curiously at the base of the shelves. He continued his exploration, finding a small refrigeration unit still humming quietly in the corner, powered by what appeared to be a sophisticated solar battery system. Inside were dozens of vials containing clear liquid, preserved samples of the compound itself, still viable after all these years. The level of planning and foresight was remarkable. Dr. Bennett hadn't just hidden her research, she had preserved it for the future, ensuring it would survive long after she was gone. As Thomas examined the lab more closely, he noticed something else. The entire facility had been designed to remain hidden and protected. The walls were reinforced concrete, the ceiling lined with waterproof material. The ventilation system was cleverly disguised as old tree roots penetrating the ceiling. The door was made of heavy steel with a sophisticated locking mechanism that had only rusted due to 3 decades of disuse. This wasn't a hasty hiding place. This was a fortress built to protect a legacy. After several hours of careful examination, Thomas gathered a few of the most important binders in one sample jar containing the ghost fern. He couldn't risk carrying all of the research back to the house at once, but he needed to study it more carefully to understand exactly what he had found. Before leaving, he made sure everything was as he had found it, then carefully closed and concealed the door, piling branches and leaves over it as it had been. As they made their way back through the forest, Scout trotting proudly beside him, Thomas felt the weight of the binders in his backpack like a physical manifestation of the responsibility he had just inherited. Sleep did not come easily to Thomas that night. The discovery in the hidden lab had changed everything. He sat late into the night at the dusty dining table, a single battery-powered lantern casting a pool of light, reading Dr. Bennett's work page by page. The sheer brilliance of her research was staggering, a symphony of chemistry and botany that he could only partially grasp. But he understood the conclusion. She had found a cure. Before dawn, he carefully hid the binders in his footlocker and tried to get a few hours of rest. But his mind was racing. What was he supposed to do with this information? Go to the police? The same police who had barely investigated a woman's disappearance 30 years ago, in a town where the Prescott family seemed to hold all the power? The next morning, Thomas resumed work on the house, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. He spent the day clearing debris from the kitchen, but his thoughts kept drifting to the hidden lab and its secrets. A knot of paranoia had taken root in his gut. The quiet of the farm no longer felt entirely peaceful. It felt watchful. He was a soldier again, on guard duty in hostile territory. Late in the afternoon, as Thomas was carrying a load of trash to his makeshift burn pile, he noticed something odd. Scout, who had been exploring the yard, suddenly froze. His ears perked forward, his body tense. Thomas followed the dog's gaze and caught a brief flash of movement at the edge of the forest. Just a shadow, there and gone so quickly he might have imagined it, but Scout's reaction told him it was real. Someone was watching the farm. Thomas casually dropped the trash bag and walked toward the house, keeping his movements relaxed and unaware. Once inside, he positioned himself at a window where he could observe the tree line without being seen. For nearly an hour, he saw nothing. Then, just as the sun was beginning to set, he caught it, a glint of light reflecting off glass, probably binoculars or a camera lens, deep in the shadows of the pines. His military training kicked in. Someone was conducting surveillance on his property. They were being careful, professional even, but not careful enough to fool a man who had spent years in war zones, or a buddy with Scout's keen senses. Thomas spent the night on high alert, checking windows, listening for unusual sounds. He kept Scout close, knowing the dog's senses were sharper than his own. But whoever had been watching did not approach the house. By morning, Thomas was exhausted but resolute. He needed more information, and he needed allies. He decided to visit Eleanor Winters. Her knowledge of the area and its history might provide insights he couldn't get elsewhere. After securing the house and making sure Scout had food and water, Thomas drove the short distance to Eleanor's property, a neat, well-maintained farmhouse with the red mailbox she had mentioned. Eleanor was in her garden, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and gloves, kneeling beside a row of tomato plants. She looked up as Thomas's van pulled in, a smile crinkling the corners of her eyes. "Thomas Hayes," she said, getting to her feet with the careful movements of someone managing arthritic joints. "I was wondering when you'd come calling. How's that old house treating you?" "It's a challenge," Thomas admitted, "but I'm making progress." Eleanor nodded. "Come inside, I've just made lemonade." Her kitchen was warm and inviting, smelling of fresh bread and herbs. The lemonade was cold and tart, served in heavy glass tumblers that looked decades old. They sat at a round oak table by a window overlooking the garden. "I expect you have questions," Eleanor said, her blue eyes sharp and knowing. Thomas nodded. "About Dr. Bennett and the Prescotts." Eleanor's expression grew serious. "I figured as much. What have you found?" Thomas hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Some of her journals, and I know she was working on something important, a treatment for Alzheimer's, something Ethan Prescott wanted badly." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, studying Thomas with an intensity that belied her age. Finally, she seemed to come to a decision. "Julia Bennett was my friend," she said, "one of the finest people I've ever known. Brilliant, of course, but also kind, principled. She came here to study the plants in our forests, plants that grow nowhere else in the world. She believed nature had already created the cures for our worst diseases. We just had to learn how to listen." Eleanor took a sip of her lemonade, her gaze drifting to the window. The ghost fern was her obsession, a rare species that only grows in the deepest, oldest parts of these forests. Most people never even see it. But Julia found it, and she discovered something in it, something miraculous. She looked back at Thomas, a compound that could actually repair damaged brain cells, not just slow the progression of Alzheimer's, but reverse it. "And Prescott wanted it," Thomas said. Eleanor nodded, her expression darkening. Ethan Prescott was already a powerful man, but he wanted more. His company had spent millions developing their own Alzheimer's drug, only to have it fail spectacularly in trials. When he learned about Julia's research, he saw a way to recoup his losses and save his reputation. He offered to buy her research? At first, yes, offered her a fortune, but Julia refused. She didn't trust him to make the treatment available to everyone who needed it. She knew he'd patent it, price it out of reach for ordinary people. They argued about it for months. Eleanor's voice dropped lower. Then the threats began. Strange men watching the farm, vandalism, her car was tampered with. The local sheriff, in Prescott's pocket of course, dismissed her concerns. "And then she vanished," Thomas said quietly. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "One day she was just gone. The police made a show of investigating, but it was all for appearance. Everyone knew what had happened, but no one could prove anything. The Prescotts own this valley, you see. They own the police, the courts, the newspapers. They even tried to buy the farm after Julia disappeared, but her will had left it to a conservation trust. It's been tied up in legal battles for decades, which is why it ended up in that county auction. Thomas felt a chill. And now I own it. Yes, Eleanor said, reaching across the table to pat his hand, and I think that terrifies them. They've spent 30 years trying to find Julia's research. They tore that house apart looking for it. They've had the property watched all these years, making sure no one got too curious. And now you show up, a stranger, an outsider, living in that house. I saw someone watching yesterday, Thomas admitted. Eleanor didn't seem surprised. They'll be watching to see if you find anything. And if they think you have, she didn't need to finish the sentence. The implication was clear. Why are you telling me all this? Thomas asked. Because someone needs to know the truth, Eleanor said firmly. I'm an old woman. I've kept Julia's secret for 30 years, but I won't live forever. Someone needs to carry on to make sure her work isn't lost, or worse, stolen by the people who killed her. Thomas sat back, the weight of her words settling on him. You think her research is still out there somewhere? Eleanor's gaze was steady. I know Julia. She would have protected it, hidden it where they couldn't find it. She was always thinking ahead. Thomas didn't mention the hidden lab, not yet. He needed to be certain of Eleanor's trustworthiness, though his instincts told him she was genuine. There's something else you should know, Eleanor continued. The Prescotts are making another push to develop an Alzheimer's drug. It's all over the local paper. They've announced a major breakthrough, with clinical trials starting soon. After 30 years of failure, suddenly they have something promising. Her eyes narrowed. Convenient timing, don't you think? Thomas felt a surge of anger. You think they finally found her formula? Or part of it, Eleanor said, but maybe not all. Maybe that's why they're still watching the farm. As Thomas drove back to the farm, his mind was racing. Eleanor's story had confirmed his worst suspicions. The Prescotts had almost certainly murdered Dr. Bennett, and now they were preparing to profit from her stolen research. But they didn't have everything. The hidden lab proved that. Dr. Bennett had been clever enough to create a secure location for her most important work. Somewhere the Prescotts had never found despite decades of searching. He was so lost in thought that he almost missed it. A black SUV parked on the side of the road about half a mile from his turnoff. As he passed, he caught a glimpse of a man inside, pretending to read a map, but clearly tracking Thomas's van with his eyes. Surveillance. Professional and persistent. Thomas didn't turn his head or give any indication he had noticed. He continued driving normally, turned onto his driveway, and parked in front of the house. Scout greeted him with enthusiasm, showing no signs of distress, which meant no one had approached the house while Thomas was gone. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the hidden lab, about the Prescotts, about Dr. Bennett's fate. He had stumbled into a decades-old murder case, and the killers were still at large, still powerful, and now aware of his presence. He needed to be prepared. The next morning, Thomas filled Scout's water bowl from a jug he'd brought from town. As he set it down on the kitchen floor, Scout approached, sniffed at the water, then suddenly recoiled with a disgusted snort. He backed away as if the bowl contained a snake, then looked up at Thomas and let out a single sharp bark. What's wrong with it? It's just water, Thomas said, puzzled. He turned on the tap he had recently connected to the well, intending to fill the bowl again. Scout's reaction was immediate and frantic. He began barking loudly, a series of urgent, high-pitched alarms. He pushed his head between Thomas and the sink, physically blocking him from the stream of water. Scout, what has gotten into you? Thomas said, pushing the dog gently aside. Scout refused to be moved. He barked again, this time with a note of desperation that chilled Thomas to the bone. This was not a game. This was a serious warning. Trust the dog. The thought was immediate and absolute. Thomas shut off the tap and looked at the bowl of water on the floor. It looked clear. It looked normal. But Scout would not go near it. His stomach clenched. He walked out the back door and headed directly for the old stone well that served as the farm's only water source. As he got closer, he noticed something was wrong. The heavy circular wooden cover, which he knew he had seated firmly the day before, was slightly ajar, shifted just an inch. He lifted it off. An acrid, faintly oily chemical smell immediately hit him, burning his nostrils. It was not the clean, earthy scent of fresh well water. It was the smell of poison. Someone had come onto his property in the dead of night and deliberately contaminated his water supply. If it weren't for Scout, he would have been drinking it, making coffee with it. The thought sent a wave of cold fury through him. This was no longer just surveillance. This was a direct attack. Thomas spent the rest of the day hauling bottled water from his van, his mind racing. This was a clear escalation from a veiled threat to a potentially lethal attack. They weren't just trying to scare him off anymore. He decided to report the incident, though he had little hope of an official response. He drove to the Raven Valley Sheriff's Office, a small brick building next to the town's single traffic light. Inside, a bored-looking deputy sat at a desk, flipping through a magazine. "Can I help you?" the deputy asked, not bothering to stand. "I need to report a trespasser," Thomas said. "Someone tampered with my well." The deputy raised an eyebrow. "Name and address?" "Thomas Hayes, Oakwood Farm." At the mention of the farm, a flicker of recognition crossed the deputy's face. He set down his magazine. "Wait here." A few minutes later, a heavy-set man in his late 50s emerged from a back office. He had a drooping mustache and a perpetually bored expression, as if every call was an interruption to his eventual retirement. "Sheriff Victor Bailey," he said, offering a limp handshake. "You're the new owner of the old Bennett place." "That's right," Thomas said. "Someone trespassed on my property last night and contaminated my well with some kind of chemical." Sheriff Bailey's expression didn't change. "That's a serious accusation. What makes you think someone tampered with your well?" Thomas explained about the displaced cover, the chemical smell, and Scout's reaction. As he spoke, he noticed the sheriff's eyes taking on a dismissive glaze. "Probably just some local kids playing a prank," Bailey said when Thomas finished. "Dumping something they shouldn't have. Happens sometimes." "This wasn't a prank," Thomas insisted. "Someone deliberately poisoned my water supply." Bailey sighed, rubbing his chin. "Look, Mr. Hayes, you're new here. You buy a rundown place like that. Sometimes you get a little trouble from local vandals. It's petty stuff. I'll file a report, but honestly, there's not much to go on. No suspects, no witnesses." "I want the water tested," Thomas said. "If there's a dangerous chemical in there—" "County doesn't have the budget for that kind of thing without solid evidence of a crime," Bailey interrupted. "My advice? Clean out your well, get a better lock for your gate, and keep an eye out for teenagers." It was clear the sheriff had no intention of taking the complaint seriously. Thomas left the station feeling frustrated, but not surprised. Eleanor had warned him the local authorities were in the Prescott's pocket. As he was walking to his van, a sleek black sedan pulled up beside him. The passenger window slid down silently, revealing a man in his late 40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. He had sharp features, cold gray eyes, and the polished appearance of corporate wealth. "Mr. Hayes," the man said, his voice smooth as silk. "Alexander Reed. I represent Silver Ridge Development. Do you have a moment to talk?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded, his senses on high alert. Reed gestured to the passenger seat, but Thomas remained standing on the sidewalk. Reed smiled thinly, accepting the rejection. "I'll be direct, Mr. Hayes. My clients have a significant interest in properties in the Raven Valley area, particularly historic sites like Oakwood Farm. I've been authorized to offer you $750,000 for the property, as is. Cash transaction, we handle all the paperwork, and it can be in your account by the end of the week." The number hung in the air, stunning Thomas into silence. $750,000. It was more money than he had ever seen. It was enough to buy a proper house, a new truck, enough to live on for years. It was an escape hatch, a golden ticket out of the mess he had stumbled into. For a fleeting second, he was tempted. He could take the money, disappear, and let this dangerous secret remain buried. But then he thought of Scout saving him from the poisoned water, of Eleanor's tearful recounting of her friend's disappearance, of the brilliant woman who had given her life to protect research that could help millions. "The answer is no," Thomas said, his voice quiet but firm. The farm is not for sale. For the first time, a flicker of annoyance crossed Reed's smooth features. Mr. Hayes, perhaps you don't appreciate the generosity of this offer. An opportunity like this is unlikely to present itself again. I'll take my chances, Thomas replied, standing up straight, shoulders back, the posture of a man who had faced down worse threats than a corporate lawyer. Reed stared at him for a long, calculating moment. The mask of politeness slipped away entirely. The smile vanished, and his eyes became as hard and cold as river stones. This property has a complicated history, Mr. Hayes, he said, his voice now laced with ice. My clients have an interest in seeing that history remain undisturbed. Some things are better left buried in the past. The veiled threat hung in the quiet air. It would be a shame if someone were to stir up trouble for themselves by digging where they shouldn't. Reed handed Thomas a business card. When you reconsider, and you will, call me. The offer has an expiration date. The window slid up, and the black sedan pulled away smoothly, leaving Thomas standing on the sidewalk, the card clutched in his hand. The encounter with Reed had confirmed what Thomas already suspected. The Prescotts were getting nervous. They knew about the journal he had found, perhaps had been watching when Scout discovered it. But they didn't know about the hidden lab. If they did, they wouldn't be offering to buy the farm. They would be tearing it apart. That night, Thomas sat on his porch, a cup of coffee in his hands, shielded at his feet. The stars were brilliant in the clear country sky, a sight so rare in the city that it still took his breath away. But he couldn't enjoy it. His mind was consumed with the day's events, the poisoned well, the dismissive sheriff, the offer to buy the farm, the threats. He was in danger and he knew it. The question was, what should he do next? A soft crunch of tires on gravel announced a visitor. Thomas tensed, his hand automatically reaching for the shotgun he had propped against the wall beside him. Scout stood, alert but not aggressive, his tail giving a cautious wag. Headlights swept across the yard, and Thomas recognized Robert's pickup truck. He relaxed slightly but kept the shotgun within reach. Robert stepped out carrying a toolbox and what looked like a water testing kit. He approached the porch, his expression grim. Eleanor called me, he said without preamble. Said you might need some help. Thomas eyed the water testing kit. You heard about the well? Robert nodded. News travels fast. Thought you might want to know what exactly they put in there. Sheriff wouldn't test it, Thomas said. Robert snorted. Course not. Bailey's been in Prescott's pocket for 20 years. He set the kit on the porch. I was a water quality inspector before I retired to carpentry. Still have the equipment. Thomas felt a surge of gratitude. Thanks, Robert. I appreciate it. Don't thank me yet. Let's see what we're dealing with. They walked to the well together, flashlights illuminating the path. Robert took samples of the water, working methodically, his experienced hands moving through the testing procedures with practiced ease. Chemical herbicide, he announced after several minutes. Industrial strength, the kind they use to clear land for development. Enough of this would make you very sick. Maybe worse. Thomas felt a cold knot of anger tighten in his chest. Definitely not kids playing a prank. Definitely not, Robert agreed, packing up his equipment. This is serious, Thomas. These people don't mess around. I'm starting to realize that, Thomas said. Back on the porch, Robert hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. You found something, didn't you? Something they want. Thomas studied the older man's face, looking for any sign of deception. He saw only concern and a weary kind of resignation. What do you know about all this, Robert? Robert sighed, sitting down on the porch steps. I knew Julia Bennett. Not just as a client, we were friends. I helped her build that lab in the woods. Thomas felt a jolt of surprise. You know about the lab? Robert nodded. I helped design it. Hidden entrance, reinforced walls, self-sustaining power system. It was my best work, and no one ever knew about it. He looked up at Thomas. Except you, apparently. Scout found it, Thomas admitted. The research is still there. All of it, perfectly preserved. Robert closed his eyes briefly, a look of profound relief crossing his face. Thank God. Julia always said if anything happened to her, the lab would protect her legacy until the right person came along. He looked at Thomas with new intensity. I guess that's you. I don't know about that, Thomas said. I'm just a broken-down ex-SEAL who bought a farm. Maybe that's exactly what was needed, Robert replied. Someone with training, someone who can't be easily intimidated, someone from outside who doesn't fear the Prescott name. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling between them. What did you find in there? Robert finally asked. Thomas described the lab, the research binders, the preserved samples of the ghost fern, and the compound Dr. Bennett had derived from it. She did it, Robert murmured. She actually found the cure. And the Prescotts killed her for it, Thomas said. Robert's expression darkened. I believe they did. I was out of town when she disappeared. By the time I got back, the official story was already set. She'd run off, abandoned her research. But I knew better. Julia would never have left her work unfinished. And now they're about to release a new Alzheimer's drug, Thomas said, after 30 years of failure. They found part of her research, Roberts said, enough to create something, but not the complete formula. That's why they're still after the farm. They know there's more. Thomas's mind was racing. I need to document everything in that lab, get evidence of what they've stolen. And then what? Robert asked. The local authorities won't help you. The Prescotts own half the judges in the state. Then I go higher, Thomas said firmly. FBI, federal prosecutors. Robert looked skeptical. You'd be going up against one of the most powerful families in Oregon. They've buried this for 30 years, which means the statute of limitations on murder hasn't expired, Thomas pointed out. With the right evidence, they could still be prosecuted. Robert considered this, then nodded slowly. You'll need proof beyond the research, something that directly ties the Prescotts to Julia's disappearance. One step at a time, Thomas said. First, I need to secure the lab and its contents. The Prescotts are escalating. The poisoned well, the offer to buy the farm, the threats, they're getting desperate. And desperate people are dangerous, Robert warned. You need to be careful, Thomas. After Robert left, Thomas couldn't sleep. The stakes had just been raised significantly. He wasn't just protecting an old house anymore. He was gathering evidence for a murder case against one of the most powerful families in the state. He spent the next day reinforcing the house's security as best he could with limited resources, boarding up broken windows, adding padlocks to doors, creating makeshift alarms with fishing line and tin cans. It wasn't much, but it might give him warning if someone tried to break in. In the afternoon, he returned to the hidden lab, bringing a digital camera he had purchased in town. He meticulously photographed every page of the research binders, every sample jar, every diagram on the walls. It took hours, but when he was done, he had a complete digital record of Dr. Bennett's work. As he was finishing, Scout, who had been patiently lying near the entrance, suddenly stood, ears forward, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Thomas immediately turned off his flashlight, plunging the lab into darkness. He moved silently to the steps, listening intently. At first, he heard nothing. Then faintly, the sound of voices drifted down from above. At least two men speaking in hushed tones. He must be around here somewhere. The dog led him this way yesterday. Prescott's getting impatient. If Hayes found something, we keep looking. Check every inch of these woods if we have to. Thomas remained perfectly still, barely breathing. Scout stood beside him, tense but silent, trained not to bark without command. They were searching for the lab. The voices grew fainter, moving away from the hidden entrance. Thomas waited a full 30 minutes before daring to move. When he finally ascended the steps and peered out, the forest was quiet, no sign of the searchers. He carefully secured the lab door and recamouflaged it, then took a circuitous route back to the house, moving silently through the underbrush as he had been trained to do in the military. The encounter in the woods confirmed his fears. The Prescotts were actively searching for the lab. It was only a matter of time before they found it. He needed to act quickly. That evening, a thunderstorm rolled in, bringing heavy rain and wind that rattled the old farmhouse. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, reviewing the digital photos of Dr. Bennett's research on his laptop. The more he studied it, the more he understood the true magnitude of her discovery. This wasn't just an incremental advance in Alzheimer's treatment. It was a fundamental breakthrough that could change millions of lives. A flash of lightning illuminated the kitchen, followed by a deafening crack of thunder. Scout, lying at Thomas's feet, suddenly raised his head, ears perked forward. Then the power went out. Thomas wasn't surprised. The farmhouse's electrical connection was tenuous at best. He reached for the flashlight he kept nearby and switched it on. A knock at the front door made him freeze. Scout was on his feet instantly, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Thomas moved cautiously to the window, staying to one side to avoid being silhouetted. Through the rain-streaked glass, he could make out a figure on the porch, a woman, her hair plastered to her head by the downpour. "Mr. Hayes," she called, her voice barely audible over the storm. "It's Mara Winters, Eleanor's daughter." Thomas hesitated, suspicious of any unexpected visitor, especially on a night like this. But Scout's demeanor had changed. The growl had stopped, replaced by a curious tilt of the head. Keeping the shotgun close, Thomas opened the door a crack. The woman on the porch was in her early 40s, with the same bright blue eyes as Eleanor, though her hair was dark rather than white. She was soaked through, her rain jacket doing little to keep out the deluge. "My mother sent me," she said, shivering slightly. "She's worried. There are men watching your house from the road." Thomas opened the door wider, allowing her to step inside. "How many?" "Two that I could see, in a black SUV about half a mile down the road." She pushed wet hair from her face. "I'm a nurse at Raven Valley Medical Center. I was coming off shift when Mom called me. She said I should warn you." Thomas offered her a towel, which she accepted gratefully. "Thank you for coming all this way." "Mom doesn't get worked up over nothing," Mara said, drying her hair. "If she's worried about you, there's good reason." "You know about the history here?" Thomas asked, watching her carefully. Mara's expression darkened. "I know Dr. Bennett disappeared under suspicious circumstances. I know the Prescotts were involved. I know my mother has carried that knowledge for 30 years. She met Thomas's gaze directly. "And I know they poisoned your well yesterday." "Word travels fast," Thomas commented. "Small town," Mara said with a shrug that reminded him of Eleanor. "Mom said you found something. Something important." Thomas didn't immediately respond, still wary of revealing too much. Mara seemed to sense his hesitation. "I'm not here to pry, Mr. Hayes. I'm here to help. The Prescotts have ruled this valley through fear for decades. It's time someone stood up to them." "Why now?" Thomas asked. "Why me?" Mara's eyes showed a flash of old pain. "Because Dr. Bennett was more than just my mother's friend. She was my aunt, my mother's sister." Thomas stared at her in surprise. "Eleanor never mentioned." "She's protective of me," Mara explained. "Keeps me separate from all this. But I've known the truth since I was 12. I knew my aunt was murdered, and I knew who was responsible." Her voice hardened. "I've spent my career at that hospital, watching the Prescotts donate wings and get buildings named after them, all while knowing what they did, what they're still doing." "What do you mean?" "Their new Alzheimer's drug," Mara said. "It's being fast-tracked through trials at our hospital. I've seen the preliminary data. It works, Mr. Hayes. It actually reverses symptoms in early-stage patients." "They stole it," Thomas said, his anger rising. "They stole Dr. Bennett's formula, or part of it." "I believe they did," Mara agreed, "but they're missing something. The trials show side effects they can't explain or control. The drug works, but it's unstable, incomplete." "Because they don't have the full research," Thomas said, pieces clicking into place. "They found some of her notes, but not the final formula." Mara nodded. "That's my guess. And now they're desperate to find the rest before their trials collapse completely." Thomas made a decision. "I found her hidden laboratory. The complete research is there, preserved exactly as she left it." Mara's eyes widened, a look of wonder and validation crossing her face. "She did it. She actually found a cure. And died protecting it," Thomas said grimly. "I've documented everything, but I need more. I need proof that connects the Prescotts directly to her disappearance." Mara's expression became thoughtful. "There might be something. A patient was brought in the night my aunt disappeared, an elderly man with a gunshot wound. He claimed he had been hunting and accidentally shot himself, but the timing always seemed suspicious to me. My mother mentioned once that this man worked as a caretaker for the Prescotts." "Do you know his name?" Thomas asked, his pulse quickening. "Harris, Frank Harris." Mara frowned. "He died about 10 years ago, but his records would still be in the hospital archives." "Could you access them?" Mara hesitated only briefly before nodding. Yes, it wouldn't be strictly ethical, but given the circumstances, we need everything we can get, Thomas said. The Prescotts are escalating. They poisoned my well. They're watching the house. They're searching the woods. It's only a matter of time before they make a more direct move. A crash of thunder punctuated his words, making them both jump. Scout, who had been quiet, suddenly tensed, his attention focused on the window. Thomas moved to look outside. Through the rain streaked glass, he could see headlights approaching slowly up the driveway. Expecting someone else? Mara asked, tension in her voice. No, Thomas said grimly, reaching for his shotgun. Get away from the windows. The headlights grew brighter as the vehicle approached the house. It wasn't the black SUV Mara had described. It was a mud-spattered pickup truck. As it drew closer, Thomas recognized it. Robert's truck. He lowered the shotgun slightly, but remained wary as he moved to the door. Robert emerged from the truck, hurrying through the rain to the porch. Thomas, he called urgently, we need to talk, now. Thomas opened the door and Robert rushed in, dripping water onto the floor. He nodded a brief greeting to Mara, then turned to Thomas, his expression grave. They know, he said without preamble. Prescott's men found the lab. Thomas felt his stomach drop. When? About an hour ago, I was driving back from town and saw them coming out of the woods. 3 men, looking very pleased with themselves. They didn't see me, but I heard them talking about finding the old woman's hideout. Did they take anything? Thomas asked, dreading the answer. I don't know, Robert admitted, but we have to assume they'll be back with more men, probably tonight. They'll clean the place out. Thomas thought quickly. I've photographed everything, all the research, the samples, the formulas. But we need the physical evidence too, the actual samples of the compound. They'll be watching the woods, Robert warned. Not in this storm, Thomas said. Not if they think they can come back later with reinforcements. Robert looked at him with grudging admiration. You're going back out there. Right now, Thomas confirmed, while the storm gives us cover. Mara stepped forward. I'm coming with you. I'm a nurse. I know how to handle and transport biological samples. Thomas started to object, but the determination in her eyes stopped him. She had as much right to be involved as anyone, more perhaps given her relationship to Dr. Bennett. All right, he conceded, but we move fast, get what we need, and get out. No heroics. He turned to Robert. Can you stay here with Scout? I need someone to watch the house, and he knows you. Robert nodded. Be careful out there. Thomas and Mara donned rain gear and headed out into the storm, the darkness and driving rain providing a natural cloak for their movements. They moved through the forest, flashlights kept low to the ground, following the path Thomas had taken earlier that day. When they reached the hidden lab entrance, Thomas was relieved to find it still concealed. Either the Prescott men hadn't disturbed the camouflage, or they had been careful to replace it after their discovery. They descended into the lab, and Thomas immediately saw that things had been disturbed. Papers were out of place, binders had been moved, drawers left partially open. But to his relief, the refrigeration unit containing the compound samples appeared untouched. They were searching, not taking, he said quietly to Mara. They must be planning to come back with proper equipment to transport everything. Mara was already examining the refrigeration unit. These samples need to be kept at a specific temperature. I can prepare them for transport, but we'll need to move quickly. Take what you need, Thomas instructed. I'm going to look for anything we might have missed. While Mara carefully packed the compound samples, Thomas searched the lab more thoroughly than he had before. In his previous visits, he had focused on the research itself, the scientific breakthrough. Now he was looking for something more personal, something that might connect directly to the Prescotts. His search led him to a small cabinet beneath one of the workbenches that he had overlooked before. It was locked, but the lock was simple. Using a small tool from his pocket, he managed to open it. Inside was a single item, a cassette tape recorder, the kind journalists and investigators used in the 80s, with a tape still inside. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. He pressed the play button, but nothing happened. The batteries were long dead. I found something, he told Mara, showing her the recorder, but it needs batteries. Check the drawers, she suggested. Dr. Bennett seems to have thought of everything else. Thomas searched the nearby drawers and, remarkably, found a sealed package of alkaline batteries. The packaging was old, but when he opened it, the batteries seemed intact. He installed them in the recorder with trembling fingers and pressed play. At first, there was just a hiss of static. Then a woman's voice, clear and resolute. "For the record, I am again refusing your offer, Mr. Prescott. My work is not for sale, not at any price." A man's voice responded, dripping with arrogance and impatience. "Doctor, don't be a fool. You're a woman playing with plants in the woods. I'm offering you a fortune, a chance to have your name in the history books. Without my company, that formula of yours will rot in this barn with the rest of your quaint little projects." "The formula belongs to the people who need it," Dr. Bennett's voice replied, unwavering. "Not to your shareholders. I will not allow you to patent it and charge a fortune for something nature has provided." There was a pause, and then Prescott's voice dropped, losing its condescending tone and becoming something cold and dangerous. "You are making a very serious mistake. You have no idea who you are dealing with. I have built an empire, and I did not do it by letting sentimental old women stand in my way. You will give me that research. It is not a request." "And if I refuse?" she challenged. The final words on the tape sent a shard of ice through Thomas's veins. "Then you will have nothing, doctor, and no one will ever find you to ask what happened. Everyone has a weakness. Everyone has something to lose." The tape clicked and went silent, the only sound the faint hiss of the empty recording. Thomas and Mara stared at each other, the implications hanging heavy in the air between them. They had just heard Ethan Prescott directly threaten Dr. Julia Bennett days before her disappearance. "This is it," Mara whispered. "This is proof." Thomas carefully removed the tape and pocketed it. "Let's get everything we can carry and get out of here. We don't know how they'll be back." They worked quickly, gathering the most critical samples and documents. Thomas took one final look around the lab, knowing it might be the last time anyone saw it intact. Bennett had built this place as a fortress to protect her legacy, and it had done its job for 30 years. Now that legacy was in their hands. As they climbed the steps to leave, a sound from above froze them in place, voices approaching through the rain. Thomas quickly extinguished their flashlight, plunging them into darkness. "Should be right around here," a man's voice said, barely audible over the storm. "Are you sure? I can barely see a damn thing in this rain," another voice complained. Prescott said, "Secure the site until morning. That's what we're going to do." Thomas signaled to Mara to remain absolutely still. They were trapped in the lab, with Prescott's men directly above them. Any attempt to leave would expose them. They waited in tense silence, listening to the men moving around outside. After several minutes, it became clear the men were setting up some kind of position, probably a tent or shelter to wait out the storm while guarding the lab entrance. Thomas leaned close to Mara's ear. "We need another way out," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. "Is there one?" she whispered back. Thomas thought hard, trying to remember the lab's layout. Dr. Bennett had been thorough and forward-thinking. Would she have built this place with only one exit? He felt along the walls in the darkness, searching for any irregularity. Near the back of the lab, behind the refrigeration unit, his fingers detected a slight change in the texture of the concrete. It wasn't a crack, but a deliberate seam. Following it, he traced the outline of what appeared to be a small door, about 3 feet square. There was no handle, but as he pressed against different points, he felt a section give slightly, a hidden release mechanism. With a soft click, a panel swung inward, revealing a narrow tunnel. "Emergency exit," Thomas whispered to Mara, who had joined him. She really did think of everything. The tunnel was tight, forcing them to crawl on hands and knees. It sloped upward gently, running for what felt like at least 50 yards before ending at another small door. Thomas pushed it open cautiously, finding himself emerging from what appeared to be an old hollow log in a different part of the forest, well away from the lab entrance. The rain was still pouring down, providing cover as they made their way back toward the farmhouse. They moved carefully, staying off the paths, aware that there might be more of Prescott's men in the woods. When they finally reached the house, they found Robert waiting anxiously on the porch, Scout beside him. "Thank God," he said as they approached. "I was about to come looking for you." "Prescott's men showed up," Thomas explained as they hurried inside. "They're guarding the lab entrance, but we found another way out." "Did you get what you needed?" Robert asked. Thomas held up the tape recorder. This, plus the samples Mara packed. It's not everything, but it's enough. Enough for what? Robert asked. To go to the FBI, Thomas said firmly. We have Dr. Bennett's complete research, proof that Prescott threatened her days before she disappeared, and evidence that their new drug is based on her stolen work. It's time to end this, once and for all. As they dried off and examined their finds, Thomas felt a growing sense of purpose. After decades of darkness, the truth about Dr. Julia Bennett was finally coming to light. Her work would not be stolen, her murder would not go unpunished, and her legacy would live on as she had intended, to help those in need, not to fill the coffers of those who had taken her life. But as the storm raged outside, Thomas knew the most dangerous part of their journey was still ahead. The Prescotts had killed once to protect their interests. They wouldn't hesitate to do so again. Morning came with a pale, unburdened light filtering through the windows of the old farmhouse. Thomas hadn't slept. None of them had. The night had been spent organizing their evidence, preparing the samples Mara had retrieved, and planning their next move. The FBI field office is in Portland, Thomas said, spreading a map across the kitchen table. About 3 hours from here. We should split up, Mara suggested. They'll be watching the roads. If we all leave together, we're an easy target. Thomas nodded in agreement. I'll take the evidence and head to Portland. Robert, can you and Eleanor create a diversion? Something to keep Prescott's people occupied here? I can do better than that, Robert said. I can get word to some of the old-timers in town. There are plenty of folks who've been afraid of the Prescotts for decades but might stand with us if they knew the truth. And I can access those hospital records, Mara added. If Frank Harris was treated for a gunshot wound the night my aunt disappeared, that's another piece of evidence. Thomas looked at the two of them, feeling a surge of gratitude. A week ago, he had been alone, a broken man with nothing but a bond and demons. Now he had allies, purpose, and for the first time in years, hope. We need to move quickly, he said. Once Prescott realizes what we have, he'll do everything in his power to stop us. They agreed to meet that evening at Eleanor's house to combine their findings before Thomas made the journey to Portland. As a final precaution, Thomas copied all the digital photos of the research onto 3 separate flash drives, giving one to Mara and one to Robert, keeping the third for himself. If anything happens to one of us, the others still have the evidence, he explained. After Mara and Robert left, Thomas spent the morning meticulously packing the physical evidence, the tape recorder, the sample vials, and key documents from the lab. He placed everything in a waterproof bag, then concealed it in a hidden compartment he'd fashioned in his van. Scout seemed to sense the tension, staying close to Thomas, his dark eyes alert and watchful. Thomas knelt beside him, running a hand through the dog's thick fur. We're almost there, boy, he murmured. Just a little longer. Around noon, Thomas decided to make a final check of the property before heading to Eleanor's. He wanted to ensure nothing valuable had been left behind that might fall into Prescott's hands. As he was examining the study one last time, Scout suddenly froze. His ears pricked forward, his body rigid with attention. Thomas instantly went still, listening. For a moment he heard nothing, then a soft crunch of gravel outside, a footstep, carefully placed. Someone was approaching the house, trying to remain undetected. Thomas moved silently to the window, staying to one side to avoid being seen. Through a gap in the curtain, he spotted 2 men in dark clothing moving stealthily toward the front porch. They carried no visible weapons, but their manner was unmistakably professional. These weren't local thugs, but trained operatives. Prescott was done with intimidation. He had sent men to eliminate the problem. Thomas's military training kicked in. The house had only 2 viable exits. The front door, now covered by the approaching men, and the back door, which might already be watched. The windows were an option, but would make him an easy target. He needed a diversion. Moving swiftly but silently, Thomas grabbed his shotgun and the small go-bag he'd prepared for emergencies. He whistled softly to Scout, giving the hand signal for silence. The dog immediately went still, awaiting instructions. Thomas moved to the kitchen where he'd left a camping stove set up. He turned the gas on full but didn't light it. The odor would be noticeable within minutes. Then he took a kitchen timer, set it for 2 minutes, and placed it beside the stove. He and Scout retreated to the back of the house, positioning themselves in a utility room with a small window that overlooked the backyard. Sure enough, Thomas spotted a third man stationed by the tree line, watching the rear exit. When the timer went off, its sharp beeping would draw attention, and the gas smell would force the intruders to investigate. It was a small window of opportunity, but it might be enough. The seconds ticked by. Thomas heard the front door ease open, followed by the soft footfalls of men entering the house. Then the timer went off, a shrill, insistent beeping that echoed through the empty rooms. "What the hell is that?" one of the men hissed. "Check it out," another ordered. "And shut it off." Thomas heard movement toward the kitchen, followed by a sharp exclamation. "Gas! The whole place could blow." It was the moment he'd been waiting for. With the intruders distracted by the potential threat in the kitchen, Thomas eased the utility room window open. He lifted Scout through first, then squeezed his own larger frame through the narrow opening. They dropped to the ground and immediately pressed themselves against the wall of the house, out of sight of the man watching the back door. Thomas pointed silently, directing Scout's attention to the watcher. The dog understood immediately. On Thomas's signal, Scout darted away from the house, circling wide to approach the man from behind. When he was in position, Scout let out a single ferocious bark. The man spun around, momentarily distracted. It was all the time Thomas needed. He sprinted across the open space between the house and the tree line, keeping low. By the time the watcher realized his mistake, Thomas had vanished into the dense forest, Scout racing to join him. They moved quickly through the woods, following a route Thomas had mentally mapped during his previous explorations. He knew these men would pursue, and they likely had communication devices to coordinate their search. His only advantage was his knowledge of the terrain and Scout's keen senses. After a mile of hard running, Thomas paused to catch his breath and listen. In the distance, he could hear shouts and the cracking of branches. The men were following, but they were struggling with the dense undergrowth. "This way, boy," Thomas whispered to Scout, heading deeper into the forest, toward a small stream he had discovered days earlier. When they reached the water, Thomas and Scout waded upstream for several hundred yards, leaving no footprints to follow. Eventually, they emerged on a rocky bank and continued their journey, now moving in a wide arc that would eventually bring them back toward the road, but far from the farmhouse. It took nearly 2 hours of careful navigation through the forest before Thomas felt safe enough to approach the main road. When he finally did, he was several miles from the farm, near a bend where the road curved around a hillside. He needed transportation, and he needed it soon. As if in answer to his unspoken prayer, he heard the rumble of an approaching vehicle. Thomas concealed himself and Scout behind a cluster of boulders and watched as a familiar truck came into view. Faye Morgan's delivery truck for her general store. Thomas stepped out onto the road, waving his arms. Faye braked hard, her eyes widening in recognition and concern. "Thomas? What on earth?" "I need your help," he said, approaching the driver's window. Men came to the farm, Prescott's men. Faye's expression hardened. "Get in," she said, jerking her head toward the passenger door. "Both of you." Thomas and Scout climbed into the truck, and Faye immediately accelerated, the tires spitting gravel. "Eleanor called me," she explained as they drove. "Said you might be in trouble. I was on my way to check on you." "Thank you," Thomas said, still catching his breath. "I need to get to Eleanor's house. We're meeting there before I head to Portland with evidence against Prescott." Faye shot him a look of surprise and grudging respect. "You're actually going after him? No one's ever stood up to the Prescotts before." "It's time someone did," Thomas said. "We have proof he murdered Dr. Bennett and stole her research. Enough to put him away for life." Faye was quiet for a moment, then nodded decisively. "I'll get you to Eleanor's, but you should know there's talk in town. Prescott's security people have been asking questions, offering rewards for information about you and suspicious activity at the old Bennett place." "How many people would turn me in for a reward?" Thomas asked grimly. "Some would," Faye admitted, "but not everyone. The Prescotts have stepped on a lot of toes over the years, made enemies." As they approached Eleanor's driveway, Faye slowed the truck, scanning the area cautiously before turning in. "I'll keep an eye out," she promised as Thomas and Scout prepared to exit the vehicle. "If I see anything suspicious, I'll warn you." Thomas thanked her again and made his way quickly to Eleanor's front door. The elderly woman answered immediately, as if she'd been waiting just inside. "Thank heavens," she breathed, ushering them in. "Robert called. He said you might be in danger." "Men came to the farm," Thomas confirmed. "Is Mara here?" "Not yet," Eleanor said, her forehead creasing with worry. "She was going to the hospital to check those records. She should have been back by now." A cold knot of anxiety formed in Thomas's stomach. "How long ago did she leave?" 3 hours, Eleanor replied. "It shouldn't have taken more than one." Thomas exchanged a worried glance with Eleanor. Prescott's reach was extensive. If he had people at the hospital— "I need to borrow your phone," Thomas said urgently. Eleanor pointed to an old landline on the wall. Thomas dialed the hospital's main number and asked for Mara Winters. After a brief hold, the receptionist returned with concerning news. "Nurse Winters left several hours ago," she informed him. "She mentioned a family emergency." Thomas thanked her and hung up, his concern deepening. "She's not at the hospital, and she didn't mention any family emergency to us." Eleanor's face went pale. "You don't think—" "I think Prescott has realized we're gathering evidence," Thomas said grimly, "and he's taking steps to stop us." Before they could discuss further, Robert's truck pulled into the driveway. The older man hurried inside, his face tight with worry. "The whole town's buzzing," he reported. "Prescott's people are everywhere, asking questions, making threats. And there's something else. The sheriff's deputies are looking for you, Thomas. They're saying you broke into the old lab at Prescott Biotech and stole research materials." "They're trying to frame me," Thomas realized. "Turn this into a criminal investigation with me as the suspect." "It gets worse," Robert continued. "I heard from a friend who works at the hospital. Mara was there, accessing old records, when security detained her. They're saying she violated patient confidentiality laws." Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "They've arrested her?" "Not officially," Robert said, "but they're holding her for questioning. And guess who's on the hospital board? Ethan Prescott." Thomas paced the small living room, and his mind racing. Their carefully laid plans were unraveling. Prescott was using his influence to isolate and neutralize each of them, one by one. "We need to move now," he decided. "I have to get to Portland with the evidence we already have. It's our only chance." "What about Mara?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. "Once I reach the FBI, they can intervene," Thomas assured her, "but I need to get there first." "You can't take your van," Robert warned. "They'll be watching for it, and the sheriff probably has roadblocks set up on the main highways." "Then I'll take back roads," Thomas said, "but I need a different vehicle." Robert tossed him a set of keys. "Take my old hunting truck. It's parked behind the shed. Not much to look at, but it'll get you there, and no one will be looking for it." "Thank you," Thomas said, gripping the older man's shoulder. "Both of you, I know the risks you're taking." "Just make sure Prescott pays for what he did to Julia," Eleanor said, her voice suddenly steel beneath the frailty of age. "After 30 years, it's time." Thomas knelt beside Scout. "I need you to stay here, boy," he said, running a hand over the dog's head. "Watch over Eleanor. Keep her safe." Scout whined softly, clearly unhappy about the separation, but he settled beside Eleanor's chair, understanding his duty. "I'll be back," Thomas promised, both to the bum and to the elderly woman. With the FBI. He slipped out the back door and made his way to Robert's hunting truck, an ancient, mud-splattered vehicle that looked like it belonged to any one of 100 local hunters. Perfect for blending in. The evidence was secure in his waterproof bag, including the tape recording of Prescott's threats, the samples of the compound, and the photographs of Dr. Bennett's research. It wasn't everything he'd hoped to gather, but it would have to be enough. As Thomas drove away from Eleanor's house, taking a narrow logging road that would eventually connect to secondary highways leading to Portland, he felt a grim determination settle over him. This was no longer just about justice for a woman he had never met. It was about protecting the people who had become his friends, who had welcomed him into their community and trusted him with their long-held secrets. For the first time since leaving the military, Thomas Hayes had a mission that mattered, and he would not fail. The logging road was rough, jolting the truck with every pothole and rut. Thomas drove carefully, wary of damaging the evidence or attracting attention. The dense forest pressed in on both sides, creating a natural tunnel of green that would normally have been peaceful, but now felt claustrophobic, full of potential threats. He had been driving for nearly an hour when he spotted it, a fallen tree blocking the road ahead. It hadn't been there when Robert had used this road the day before. Thomas slowed the truck, his senses instantly on alert. This was no accident. This was an ambush. He reversed quickly, intending to find another route, but in the rearview mirror, he saw a vehicle appear behind him, blocking his retreat. He was trapped. Thomas assessed his options rapidly. He could abandon the truck and flee into the forest with the evidence, but on foot, he would be at a severe disadvantage. He could try to break through the roadblock, but the old truck might not survive the impact. Before he could decide, men emerged from the trees on both sides of the road, 4 of them armed with handguns. Thomas recognized one as the man who had been watching his house earlier. These were Prescott's private security, not local law enforcement. That might work in his favor. They would want to avoid official attention. The leader approached the driver's side window, his weapon held casually but ready. "Step out of the vehicle, Mr. Hayes," Weedy ordered. "Hands where I can see them." Thomas complied slowly, his mind racing through scenarios, looking for weaknesses, opportunities. "Alexander Reed would like a word with you," the man said, gesturing for Thomas to move away from the truck. Thomas didn't resist as they patted him down, removing his phone and the shotgun he had stowed beside the seat. But they didn't find the waterproof bag with the evidence, which he had secured in a hidden compartment under the truck bed, another of Robert's hunting modifications, designed to hide game from conservation officers during off-season hunting trips. They marched Thomas to a black SUV that had pulled up behind the truck. Inside, Alexander Reed sat in the back seat, his expression cold and professional. "Mr. Hayes," he said as Thomas was pushed into the seat beside him, "you've caused quite a bit of trouble." "Where's Mara Winters?" Thomas demanded. Reed raised an eyebrow. "Nurse Winters is cooperating with an internal hospital investigation regarding unauthorized access to confidential records. She's perfectly fine, as long as she continues to cooperate." "What do you want, Reed?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. "The same thing I wanted when we first met," Reed replied smoothly. "For you to sell the farm and move on. But now I'll need something additional. All copies of certain materials you have collected. Research documents, samples, recordings, everything." "I don't know what you're talking about," Thomas said, his face expressionless. Reed sighed as if disappointed by a child's poor attempt at lying. "Please, Mr. Hayes, we found the hidden laboratory this morning. We know you've been there, we know you've taken materials, and we know you've been conspiring with Eleanor Winters and her daughter to build some kind of case against Mr. Prescott based on absurd, decades-old rumors." He leaned closer, his voice hardening. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell us where you've hidden Dr. Bennett's research. You're going to sign over the farm to Silver Ridge Development, and then you're going to leave Oregon and never return. In exchange, we'll forget this unfortunate incident, and your new friends will be left in peace." "And if I refuse?" Thomas asked, though he could guess the answer. Reed's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Then things become much more complicated. For everyone involved." Thomas weighed his options. These men would search the truck and eventually find the hidden compartment. Even if they didn't, he was now effectively their prisoner. His only advantage was that they didn't know he had already copied the research and distributed it to Robert and Mara. "I need assurances," he said finally. "I want to see Mara Winters, make sure she's unharmed, and I want guarantees, in writing, that Eleanor and Robert will be left alone." Reed studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Reasonable requests. I'll arrange for you to see Nurse Winters. As for the guarantees..." He reached into his jacket and removed a folded document. "Mr. Prescott anticipated your concerns." He handed Thomas a legal agreement, already prepared, promising non-interference with Eleanor Winters and Robert Dalton in exchange for Thomas's cooperation and silence. "Mr. Prescott can be quite reasonable when his interests are protected," Reed commented. Thomas scanned the document, buying time, looking for a way out of this situation. These men were professionals, but they were also arrogant, convinced of their power and control. That could be exploited. "The evidence is in my van," Thomas said finally. "Hidden compartment under the driver's seat. But I want to see Mara first." Reed considered, then nodded to one of his men. "Check it." As the man moved toward Thomas's borrowed truck, Reed spoke into a phone, giving instructions for Mara Winters to be brought to their location. Thomas waited, outwardly calm, inwardly calculating. He knew the man would find nothing under the driver's seat. When he reported back, they would be angered by the deception, but also momentarily confused. That confusion might create an opportunity. Sure enough, minutes later, the man returned, shaking his head. "Nothing under the seat, sir." Reed's eyes narrowed as he turned to Thomas. "Playing games is unwise, Mr. Hayes." "I'm not playing games," Thomas replied evenly. "I'm ensuring my friend's safety before I cooperate. The evidence is there, just not where I first said." Reed studied him, suspicion warring with pragmatism. Finally, he nodded. A precaution. Understandable, if irritating. He checked his watch. "Nurse Winters should be arriving shortly. Once you've seen her, you will direct my men to the evidence. No more delays." They waited in tense silence. Thomas kept his expression neutral, but his mind was racing, formulating and discarding plans. He needed to create a diversion, something significant enough to allow him to escape with the evidence. 20 minutes later, another vehicle approached, a white hospital security van. It parked behind the SUV, and two men escorted Mara from the back. She looked tired and tense, but physically unharmed. When she saw Thomas, her eyes widened with a mixture of relief and alarm. 5 minutes, Reed instructed as Mara was brought to the SUV. "Then we conclude our business." Mara slid into the seat beside Thomas, while Reed stepped out to confer with his men, giving them a semblance of privacy. "Are you all right?" Thomas asked quietly. She nodded. "They detained me when I accessed Frank Harris's records. But I found what we were looking for, Thomas. Harris was treated for a gunshot wound the night my aunt disappeared, and the attending physician noted inconsistencies in his story about a hunting accident. Where are the records?" "I made copies," Mara whispered. "Hid them in my locker before security came, and I still have the flash drive you gave me with the research photos." Thomas felt a surge of hope. Not all was lost. "Listen carefully," he murmured. "The evidence from the lab is in a compartment under the truck bed. When I create a diversion, you need to get to that truck and drive. Take the back roads to Portland, just like we planned. Go straight to the FBI field office." "What kind of diversion?" Mara asked, her voice barely audible. "You'll know it when you see it," Thomas assured her. "Just be ready." Their conversation was cut short as Reed returned to the SUV. "Time's up," he announced. "As you can see, Mr. Hayes, Nurse Winters is perfectly fine. Now the evidence." Thomas nodded as if resigned. "It's in a hidden compartment under the truck bed. I'll show your men." Reed gestured for Thomas to exit the vehicle. As he did, Thomas noticed several things simultaneously. The positions of Reed's men, the keys still in the ignition of Robert's truck, and most importantly, a familiar sound in the distance. Barking. Scout's distinctive bark, growing closer. Thomas smiled inwardly. The loyal dog had somehow tracked him, refusing to be left behind. It was the diversion he needed. As they walked toward the truck, Scout burst from the trees, a gray and white missile of fur and teeth. The dog didn't attack but created instant chaos, barking and circling, drawing the attention of Reed's men. In that moment of distraction, Thomas moved. He drove his elbow hard into the nearest guard's solar plexus, dropping the man to his knees. In the same fluid motion, he grabbed the man's handgun and fired 2 quick shots into the air, creating more confusion. "Run!" he shouted to Mara, who didn't hesitate. She bolted for the truck, Scout racing to her side as if understanding the plan. Reed's men recovered quickly, drawing their weapons, but Thomas had positioned himself behind their fallen colleague, using him as a shield. "Drop your weapons," he commanded, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of military training. "Or this gets worse for everyone." The momentary standoff gave Mara time to reach the truck. She scrambled inside, started the engine, and began to maneuver around the fallen tree, which wasn't as completely blocking the road as it had first appeared. Reed, showing surprising composure, raised his hand slowly. "Think about what you're doing, he said. "This won't end well." "It already hasn't ended well," Thomas replied. "For Dr. Bennett, for 30 years of lies. But it ends today." As Mara successfully navigated past the roadblock, Thomas began backing away, keeping the gun trained on Reed and his men. Scout stayed with him, growling at anyone who moved toward his master. "This isn't over, Hayes," Reed called as Thomas reached the edge of the forest. "Prescott will never stop coming for you." "Count on it," Thomas replied, then turned and sprinted into the trees, Scout at his heels. He knew Reed's men would pursue, but the forest was dense, and Thomas had the advantage of Scout's senses to navigate and detect followers. They moved swiftly through the underbrush, putting distance between themselves and the road. After nearly an hour of hard travel, they reached a small clearing with a view of the valley below. Thomas paused, catching his breath, and pulled out the satellite phone Robert had given him, an old but functional device that Reed's men hadn't discovered during their search. He dialed Eleanor's number. She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with worry. "It's me," Thomas said. "Mara's safe. She's on her way to Portland with the evidence." "Thank God," Eleanor breathed. "What about you?" "Scout and I are heading back to town," Thomas explained. "There's something I need to do." "Thomas, it's too dangerous," Eleanor protested. "Prescott's people are everywhere." "Trust me," Thomas said. "I have a plan, but I need your help. Can you contact everyone you know who's ever been wronged by the Prescotts? Tell them to meet at the town square in 2 hours." After ending the call, Thomas and Scout continued their journey, circling back toward Raven Valley. He knew Reed and his men would be searching the roads to Portland, assuming he was trying to follow Mara. They wouldn't expect him to return to the very place where Prescott held the most power. As they approached the town, Thomas stopped at a small hunting cabin Robert had mentioned, a place where the older man kept emergency supplies. Inside, Thomas found what he needed: clean clothes, a first aid kit, and most importantly, a working radio that could receive local police bands. He listened to the chatter, confirming his suspicions. Sheriff Bailey had deputies searching the highways for Thomas Hayes, described as a dangerous fugitive. There was also mention of a woman in a truck, wanted for questioning, Mara. But Thomas knew the back roads Robert had recommended would keep her well away from these patrols. After cleaning up and changing clothes, Thomas and Scout made their way cautiously into town. As they approached the square, Thomas was astonished to see dozens of people already gathered, with more arriving every minute. Eleanor and Robert stood at the center, surrounded by townspeople of all ages. "What's this?" Thomas asked as he joined them, keeping a wary eye out for Prescott's security or the sheriff's deputies. "You asked for people who've been wronged by the Prescotts," Eleanor said with a small smile. "Turns out that's most of the town." Robert nodded in agreement. Once word spread that someone was finally standing up to Ethan Prescott, people started coming forward. Everyone has a story: land seized through questionable means, jobs lost over refused bribes, environmental damage covered up. Thomas looked around at the gathered faces: farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, all watching him with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "I can't guarantee this will work," he warned them. "Prescott is powerful, connected." "So are we," said a voice from the crowd. Faye Morgan stepped forward. "When we stand together." A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembly. These were people who had lived too long under the shadow of a corrupt, powerful family. They were ready for change, ready to reclaim their town. Thomas was about to speak when a commotion at the edge of the square caught everyone's attention. Sheriff Bailey and 4 deputies were approaching, hands on their weapons. "Thomas Hayes," Bailey called, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent square. "You're under arrest for breaking and entering, theft of intellectual property, and assaulting security personnel." Thomas didn't move. "On whose authority, Sheriff?" "Ethan Prescott's." Bailey's face flushed. "I have sworn statements from witnesses, paid witnesses," Thomas interrupted. "Just like you're paid to look the other way when the Prescotts break the law." The sheriff took a threatening step forward, but found his path suddenly blocked by townspeople, dozens of them, forming a human barrier between the law enforcement officers and Thomas. "You'll have to arrest all of us, Victor," Eleanor said, her voice steady and clear despite her age. Bailey looked uncertain for the first time, confronted not by a single outsider, but by the united front of his own community. "This is obstruction of justice," he blustered, but with less conviction. "No," came a new voice, strong and authoritative. "This is justice finally arriving in Raven Valley." The crowd parted to reveal a woman in her early 50s, flanked by several men and women in dark suits. She held up a badge. "Special Agent Rebecca Martinez, FBI," she announced. "Sheriff Bailey, you and your deputies need to stand down immediately." Bailey's face went from red to ashen. "This is a local matter." "Not anymore," Agent Martinez cut him off. We've been building a case against Ethan Prescott for months. Securities fraud, bribery of public officials, environmental violations, and now potential involvement in a 30-year-old homicide. She turned to Thomas. Mr. Hayes, I believe you have information relevant to our investigation. Thomas nodded, relief washing over him. Mara Winters should have reached your Portland office by now, with evidence regarding the disappearance of Dr. Julia Bennett. She did, Martinez confirmed. Quite impressive evidence, including a recorded threat from Ethan Prescott himself. We have agents taking Mr. Prescott into custody as we speak. A collective gasp went through the crowd, followed by a rising murmur of conversation. 30 years of fear and intimidation, broken in an instant. Sheriff Bailey seemed to deflate before their eyes, his authority evaporating. One of the FBI agents approached him, speaking in low tones. The sheriff reluctantly surrendered his weapon and badge. Agent Martinez turned back to Thomas. We'll need your full statement, Mr. Hayes, and we'll want to speak with everyone who has information about the Prescott's activities over the years. You'll have plenty of volunteers, Robert said, gesturing to the assembled townspeople. As the initial shock wore off, the atmosphere in the square transformed. Decades of pent-up stories began pouring out, people stepping forward to share their experiences with FBI agents who had set up impromptu interview stations. It was as if a dam had broken, releasing a flood of truth that had been held back for too long. Thomas found a quiet corner of the square to give his own statement, Scout lying patiently at his feet. He recounted everything, finding the journal, discovering the hidden lab, the attempts to intimidate and silence him, the confrontation with Reed. You took quite a risk, Agent Martinez commented when he had finished, confronting someone like Prescott without backup. I had backup, Thomas said, glancing at Scout, then at Eleanor and Robert, who were giving their own statements nearby. The best kind. Martinez smiled slightly. Still, it was brave and thorough. The evidence you and Ms. Winters collected is compelling. Combined with what we already had on Prescott, it's enough to ensure he'll spend the rest of his life in prison. What about the research? Thomas asked. Dr. Bennett's cure for Alzheimer's? That's beyond my jurisdiction, Martinez admitted. But I've alerted colleagues at the FDA and NIH. They're very interested in examining the compound. If it's as groundbreaking as it appears, they'll ensure it's developed properly and made available to those who need it. That evening, as the FBI continued their work in the town square, Thomas returned to the farmhouse with Scout, Eleanor, Robert, and a newly returned Mara. The house felt different now, no longer haunted by secrets and danger, but peaceful, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. They sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Eleanor's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Julia would have been proud, she said softly, not just of the justice, but of what will happen with her research. It will help so many people. What will you do now, Thomas? Mara asked. Will you stay? Thomas looked out at the overgrown fields, the ancient trees that bordered the property, the house that still needed so much work. He thought of the empty apartment in Portland, the ghost that had driven him to this place, the purpose he had found here. Yes, he said, feeling the rightness of the decision settle in his bones. This is home now. Robert raised his coffee mug in a toast, to new beginnings, and to Julia Bennett, who made them possible. They all raised their mugs, even Scout barking, softly as if understanding the significance of the moment. 1 year later, the transformation of Oakwood Farm was remarkable. The house had been fully restored, its white paint gleaming in the summer sun, its porch sturdy and welcoming. The once overgrown yard was now a carefully tended garden, replanted according to Dr. Bennett's original designs, with special beds dedicated to the ghost fern that had started it all. But the most significant change was to the barn, which had been converted into the Bennett Research Center, a state-of-the-art facility funded by the settlement from the Prescott estate and grants from the National Institutes of Health. Scientists from around the country came to study the unique flora of the Raven Valley forests, continuing Dr. Bennett's legacy of seeking natural cures for humanity's most challenging diseases. Thomas, once a broken man with no purpose, was now the center's director of operations, using his organizational skills to support the researchers while continuing to restore and expand the farm. Scout remained his constant companion, now joined by a younger German shepherd puppy named Nova, ensuring the tradition of loyal guardians would continue. The town of Raven Valley had changed too. With the Prescott influence removed, new businesses had opened, including a small museum dedicated to local history that prominently featured Dr. Julia Bennett's story and scientific contributions. The final exhibit was the actual recorded tape of Ethan Prescott threatening her life, a stark reminder of the cost of unchecked power and the importance of standing against it. Ethan Prescott had been convicted of first-degree murder and numerous financial crimes. He would spend the rest of his life in federal prison, his empire dismantled, his name now synonymous with corruption rather than success. Alexander Reed and Sheriff Bailey had received lesser sentences for their roles in the cover-up, but they too had faced justice at last. Most importantly, Dr. Bennett's Alzheimer's treatment had been verified, refined, and was now in advanced clinical trials, showing remarkable results in reversing the disease's progression. It would be named Bennettine in her honor, ensuring her name would be remembered not as a victim, but as a pioneer who had changed medical science forever. On the anniversary of Thomas's arrival at the farm, a special ceremony was held to dedicate a memorial garden to Dr. Bennett. The entire town turned out, along with researchers, FBI agents who had worked the case, and even national media. As Thomas stood to give his remarks, he looked out at the assembled faces. Eleanor and Mara in the front row, Robert beside them, Faye, and dozens of townspeople whose lives had been changed by the events of the past year. Scout sat attentively at his feet, as always. "A year ago, I came here with nothing but my dog and my demons," Thomas began. "I was running away from life, looking for a place to hide. What I found instead was a purpose, a community, and a chance to make a difference." He gestured to the memorial stone, which bore Dr. Bennett's likeness in a simple inscription, "Her work continues." Julia Bennett believed that nature holds the answers to our most profound challenges, if only we have the wisdom to look and the courage to protect what we find. Her life was taken because she refused to abandon that belief, because she put the well-being of others above profit and power. Thomas paused, looking at the ghost fern planted prominently in the garden, its pale fronds luminous in the afternoon light. Today, we honor not just her memory, but her vision. The Bennett Research Center will ensure that her work continues, that her discoveries benefit all people, just as she intended. And this community, which stood together against intimidation and corruption, will be the guardians of her legacy. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed, Thomas found himself alone in the garden with Scout. He knelt beside the memorial stone, placing his hand on the cool granite. "Thank you," he said quietly to the woman he had never met, whose courage had changed the course of his life, "for showing me the way home." Scout pressed against his side, a warm, solid presence, as always understanding more than a dog should. Together they walked back toward the farmhouse, no longer a broken-down shell haunted by tragic history, but a place of healing, discovery, and hope. Thomas Hayes, once lost in his own private battlefield, had found not just a house, but a home, not just a purpose, but a mission, and not just peace, but something far more precious: redemption. In saving Julia Bennett's legacy, he had saved himself.